All right. Record this just in case somebody's hoping to revisit it later. But it will only record my view. So I'm going to use this morning kind of an introduction to both the first and second of the therapeutic movement series. And we'll sort of look at some of the initial lessons very briefly and try to put them in context. The meeting of Chinese therapeutic exercise with the sort of broader context of Chinese medicine, especially channel theory and how the channel cavities, or so-called acupuncture points, are related to the exercises and really quite deeply integrated, even when they're not talked about that way explicitly. As always, I start with head carriage. And so floating the head back gently in space, turn to the side. As you said, gentle retraction of the head back over the center of the body, which you want to feel creating a little lift up through the crown. Then finally, the crown, just like the barber would, slightly to the back of the head. We feel that lift a little bit posterior, which creates a gentle lengthening in the back of my neck. And at any point, if anybody has a question, feel free to ask. I'm going to just repeat that gentle movement a few times. So I start to get the feeling of the head backward equals also a sense of lift, lengthening in the back of the neck. And the channels, or in this case, more literally what they call vessels, more like the sort of main reservoirs of the body that communicate with the more sort of broad channel network that runs through the limbs. These vessels are mostly associated with the trunk and the head and neck, so the axial skeleton. The one we're looking at first is the governing vessel or dew vessel that runs from about the tip of the tailbone up the spine, over the head along the center line, and down to the upper palate of the mouth and the upper gum. And what I'm looking to feel there is that subtle lengthening, not just in the back of the neck, but along the whole line. Now, there's not necessarily going to be much muscular change as I come up over the head. There are, of course, muscles covering the whole head and face. It's not much in the way of muscle running down the center of your nose, however, right? And really not much along that center line. So the kind of feeling, kind of activation, and the sense of lengthening we're going to get is not entirely muscular. So what's happening in the back, of course, is muscular. But it's more directly related to the connective tissue that wraps the muscles and wraps every structure in the body, that thickens to become ligaments, tendons, and even bone is full of the same collagen as this thin connective tissue, the fascia. The fascia works in largely continuous sheets, very much like the channels that cover the whole body. We can start by thinking somewhat superficially, listening for feelings maybe just under the skin. As the head floats back, Feel that gentle lengthening in the neck, the rising of the crown. When I think about the bony structures, skeleton, I want to feel a little glide right at the base of the head. So where my head is sitting on the cervical vertebra, the neck bones, the kind of gliding joint there. I think everybody who's here today has heard me talk about this before. So as the head glides back, I can feel that movement right at the base of the head. So if the primary vessel we're talking about is this governing vessel, which is called the seed of the yang channels. All the yang channels in the body are fed by this big reservoir vessel. And the yang channels would be the ones covering the outer surfaces, the dorsal surfaces of the body. So the back of the body, the flanks to a large degree, the sides wrapping around, the outer arms, the outer legs, even around to the front of the legs a little bit, are all yang surfaces. And if I were on my hands and knees, say gardening, all the areas that would get sunburned. So this subtle movement that I feel opens up an important channel cavity right at the base of the head. There are actually two right next to each other, and for our purposes, we don't really need to distinguish between them. Right, this gentle pull on the connective tissue and the adjustment of the joint there is not going to be so finely tuned that it really differentiates between 2 points that are right next to each other. I think it is an area. And then there's a channel cavity that's right at the crown of the head. We find the tips of our ears and draw lines straight up. Sometimes you can feel a slight hollow. It's a little easier for me because nothing's in the way. That's where the lift is. There's an opening or gliding sensation here. And then just at the base of the neck, I find the big bone, the most protruding bone at the base of my neck, right at the start of my upper back. Find a little hollow just below that big bone between it and the next vertebra, spinous process, part of the vertebra that sticks out. That's another one of these important channel cavities. And there I may also feel a sense of opening or a subtle lift. I can feel the upper part of the back very slightly lifted. And then all the muscles of my back, largely structured, especially the shoulders, you can think of that as like hanging a coat on a nice firm hanger. Putting that coat into storage, for instance, a winter coat for the warmer months. I want to make sure it's going to keep its shape, like give it a good frame to hang on. So thinking of the shoulders and the musculature of the back, hanging on, frame created in this subtle adjustment of posture. As I move down into my upper back, I feel the upper back spreading and rounding a little bit, subtly emphasizing that roundness of the upper back. And then ideally this comes just from the adjustment of my head. So that may take a little while, that rolling the head back, opens the back and spreads it. As the shoulders broaden a little bit, not because I'm doing anything with my shoulder muscles, but because I'm changing the support for them, underlying support, I can relax and release down from my arms. Again, I can repeat this movement as many times as I want, especially if it feels a little uncomfortable to hold it. I'm not quite sure I have it. And then moving down, rather than thinking of any particular cavity or point, it's often discussed as a large area, especially the area between the shoulder blades, but continuing down from there as well, where all the spinal muscles enclose the spine from either side, I want to feel a sense of those also spreading, opening, relaxing, and releasing. Releasing tension, there can be a subtle movement outward as the back feels a little rounder, as well as a release down. If I continue that release down through the lower back is hanging straight. And then perhaps I can even drop the pelvis towards the floor. And I'm sitting back a little in my hips at the same time. So sitting back in the hips, tips my trunk a little forward. That's like a counterbalance to the head moving back. Now, if we're picking a smaller area, cavity, right at the back of my waist, and we don't have to be super precise when we're doing postural adjustments and movement here. It's right at the back of the waist, so I find the space between the ribs and the top of the hip bones. And the exact point would be one of those spaces between the vertebra again. So that it's called Mingmen, often translated as the gate of life, so it makes it sound pretty important. It's associated with kidneys. And a sense of fullness and stability in the whole low back area. So as I'm relaxing through the low back, seemingly contradictorily, my back will also feel more stable. It's a kind of relaxed strength that comes along with that, sense of fullness. It's part of that stability. And as the back of my hips and pelvis drop towards the floor, it feels like my tailbone just drops onto the body without tucking it and holding it. So it feels a bit more passive. A little bit of flexion here at the hips, folding in, almost sitting back slightly, as well as flexing my knees. It's going to make that possible. Release my weight down through the body, down through the arms, down through the legs. Maybe the hands spread, the feet spread. As the weight starts to sink down, perhaps I start to notice a change in my breath as well. So the basic image here is that the upper body is round. It's round like the dome of the sky or the heavens. That this roundness of the back imitates the world above us. Whereas the weight sinking down and stabilizing the lower body, and you feel firm and rooted, is connecting us to the image of the earth, right? As well as very much directly to the energy of the earth. The primary energy of the earth that we're aware of all day is, of course, gravity. And if the heavens are round in the traditional Chinese worldview, the earth is considered square. Now, why would the earth be square? Well, part of the reason is that's how farmlands are often laid out. Till squares. Cities are often, especially walled cities, are built on a square paradigm. How is the lower body square in this sense? Well, if I go back to my casual posture, I probably have some significant curve in the low back, right? The pelvis is tilted a little bit forward, tailbone's lifted a little bit to the rear. In this posture, as the head floats back, the back and shoulders feel nice and round. The lower back starts to hang straight and become more vertical, as well as the orientation of the pelvis, about posterior pelvic tilt. Looking from the back, it looks more vertical and essentially square. So this is considered squaring the pelvis, and that becomes the basis for my whole lower body posture. Also, you see that my feet are parallel. We shouldn't be in a rush to force this. If I normally stand with my feet out, and I bring them too straight, it feels a little awkward. I want to back off slightly. So a more relaxed angle in the feet, but tending towards square, toeing in slightly. As the tailbone drops onto the body, we can think of the tip of the tailbone is suddenly lifted. So there's another channel cavity there. It's actually the very first point on that due vessel or governing vessel. And that can create a subtle sense of lift up through the pelvic floor, a little support, as well as a sense of lift and activation up through the whole spine in that new vessel. That's what its job is. Point of view of Chinese medicine, cavity is used for lifting the qi, activation up through the body. The one at the waist level is the fourth cavity. The one just at the base of the neck is the 14th. The one at the base of the head is the 16th. At the top is the 20th. We don't particularly need to know these numbers. But the one at the tip of the tailbone is called the tailgate. And then the life gate, fate. Fate in this case just refers to your allotted life. Right? It's fated by heaven. Then Dot's way at the top of the back with the big bone. Right? So that's straightforward enough. And then the wind repository at the base of the head. That really refers to one of the main kinds of etiology in Chinese medicine, disease-causing factors, considered to be wind in Chinese medicine, and the back of the neck and base of the head is particularly susceptible. So as we start entering the cooler weather, the idea of keeping your neck covered, right, is a pretty fundamental idea in Chinese self-care, especially when your skin might be a little warm or damp. So when you're leaving a building that's warmer, you've been exercising, you're going out into the cold, making sure the back of your neck is okay. The crown, through 20, is called a 100 meeting, meaning 100 yang channels. 100 in this case, it's just expression for all of them. And this also continues that sense of lift. The governing vessel is also considered to have a branch that moves from the base of the head through the center of the head and brain, and then coming up, connect again up the crown. And then down over the face. The 20 is not only a cavity that's used for lifting the qi, it's also used for descending any excess. So in this case, we can think of it to begin with simply as tension, any excess tension in the body. So that point fills two roles, and which one it's emphasizing depends largely on intention. Do we feel like we need a little bit more support from above, or below rather, or do we feel like we need to release more tension? Ideally, I want to find a mix of those two things, but often in the beginning, one or the other is going to feel more important. Now, coming down the face, I draw attention right now to the connection between that new vessel and the fundamental vessel running up the front center line of the body, the ren or conception. Conception is not a great translation, really, although it's pretty much universal in English. The bearing channel would be better. It's less about conceiving a child in terms of the original language and more about carrying a child. And I like that image better because it suggests support, right? A kind of nourishing support, which is something that everybody needs. And so we can even think about it, a bit of a pun that plays more to the English than it does more to the original Chinese, but if you think of that term bearing, it's like our bearing is our posture. So how do we find support in the front of the body? We think about typical Western postures often by some overt lift here. But if the back is rounding and opening and spreading, then what I find is that the front of the torso actually feels gently enclosed. That line feels slightly shortened. So the back line is lengthened, front line is a little shortened, and I think the best way to think of it is consolidated. And this describes the basic yin-yang organization of the body. Yang, in this case, the outer surfaces of the body tend towards more excess, and the yin surfaces tend more towards deficiency. And so this feeling that we're letting the back spread out, that we're moving excess from the back of the body towards the front of the body, means we can take that excess qi and let it supplement any deficiency in the front. And so when I say the front line shortens, I don't mean it sags. That's a sure sign of deficiency. But I feel like the outer body is subtly wrapping around and making the center line of the chest in particular feel like it's part of the inner body, not sagging downward, but gently enclosed or held within. So the action here again is more passive than active, not something I'm doing with it. I'm trying to hold something in here, but feeling that it feels that it belongs to the inside surfaces. And that's another yin-yang division. So yang is not just the outer surfaces of the body, but the outer body in general. Yin is the inner surfaces, but also the whole interior of the body. Yang is also the whole upper body, and yin is the whole lower body, because the sky is very yang. In fact, it's pure yang in traditional Chinese cosmology, and the earth is pure yin. Everything in between the sky and earth is some mix of the two. So the tongue, the tip of the tongue is resting on the roof of the mouth to connect these two vessels. And part of that connection is support, postural support. So instead of thinking about it as some kind of subtle, energetic circulation, let's rather think about how the tip of the tongue of the roof of the mouth activates the complex musculature inside the jaw. Right? So the base of the tongue, under the jaw, and down through the vocal diaphragm, so the larynx and pharynx, down through this area. And that way, it creates a subtle kind of adjustment to the tension there, similar to how the lift of the tip of the tailbone does. And it's pointing out a kind of communication between this area of the jaw and throat and the pelvic floor. Something increasingly that I see vocal coaches talking about. So from the point of view of Chinese medicine, we're already doing some very explicit things in terms of the body's qi. Save the definition of qi for another day, except to say that we might just call qi influences, right? Which would be more apt in many ways than calling it energy. Since in the traditional Chinese model, qi is very much a substance, it's matter, it's material, not energy per se. There's no matter-energy division in traditional Chinese thought or medicine. So there's movement out, spreading out through the back, down through the back, a sense of release of any excess tension there. any fullness, sense of stagnation, and a sense of subtle gathering, right from the jaw and throat, down through the chest, down through the abdomen as well. That REM channel, while starting in the lower palate and gum, is going to run all the way to the perineum, the low point of the torso. And that lift of the tip of the tailbone there is helping with communication. So there's a sense of this circular relationship, sometimes called the lesser circular or lesser heavenly circulation. And this becomes the foundation for just about every exercise we do. So let's look at a basic exercise that has to do with this season, the fall. And the organ system associated with the fall in particular, which is the lungs. And the lungs are associated not just with respiration, but the whole upper respiratory tract, so sinuses and whatnot, but then also out to the skin. And we actually respire through our skin to a small degree. In the most outer layer of cells does not just receive oxygen from the bloodstream, but can actually take some oxygen directly from the air. So in a very real way, respiration happens at the skin level, as well as movement of fluids, sweat, and such. And so the organ of the skin, in the medical sense, is part of this larger organ system of the lung in the Chinese sense. So in that way, it's quite different from the Western conception of the lung. Right? There are certain ways in which it's similar, the obvious ones, breathing, but it's a much broader and more complicated concept or system. So I'm just going to lift my arms up to the sides and relax them back down. But I want to connect that to the basic posture we've been talking about, this activation of the governing and conception of bearing channels, vessels. So to do that, I want to initiate a little movement of my head. I'm going to look a little bit down and a little bit up. And as I do that, I want to keep the feeling of the chin gliding back a little bit, opening up the base of the head, and then lift up through the crown of the head. Up and look down. And see if I can't let that very subtle movement of my neck start to communicate down through the spine so I feel it in my upper back as well. You can feel it all the way down, great, but right now I'm particularly interested in the area right under the collarbones, those upper ribs that are like the collar, and the uppermost part of the back above the shoulder blades. Because this is further stimulating this area in the back of the neck and the base of the head very lightly, it's considered a treatment for, again, this Chinese concept of wind. Wind is really the vehicle by which any external pathogen enters the body in traditional Chinese medicine. So certainly there's no germ theory per se in early Chinese medicine, but there is a real interest in external disease causing pathogens, which were and still are in Chinese medicine discussed in the terms of climate, heat, and cold, and dampness. But what gets them into the body and penetrates the skin and makes it sick is referred to as wind. And this is the main area for clearing wind. So if I have a cold coming on, anything like that, this is a part of the body I want to give attention to. I can make that movement a little bigger, and I can even add a little arm rotation to it. And the benefit of the arm rotation is it helps give me a little leverage on that inner shoulder area, which gives me a little more leverage on those upper ribs and my collarbones. Right? My shoulders are reaching in all the way to my breastbone, top of my breastbone, new rib, via my collarbones, clavicules. So look up, I'm going to turn my palms a little forward. That gives me a little more spreading feeling. Maybe I'm going to spread my palms a little bit. And then relax down a little bit, but still with some lift. Palms are turning back. The back feels much broader and slightly lifted now. And while I do this, my weight is still sinking down, so I'm keeping the same lower body posture. My breath is still sinking down to collect in my lower abdomen. Another really important idea about the lungs in Chinese medicine is they communicate with the kidneys. The kidneys representing the lowest or deepest organ system in the body. And so feeling like my breath reaches my lower abdomen is very useful. Now in the beginning, if you just feel like my breath is getting down to the abdomen, with diaphragmatic breathing, that's sufficient. But eventually I'm going to give a little more attention to the area under the navel. But I don't want to rush it because I never want to force my breath. It should always feel comfortable. And I may find that my breathing just starts to fall in time with the movement, as long as the movement is sufficiently slow. So I've added the subtle flexion extension in the upper spine without losing anything about the basic posture. Everything I was doing before, ideally, is maintained. In the beginning, it may be a little tricky to do that, so we're not going to worry about it, obsess about it, but we're going to check in from time to time and say the tilt of the tailbone or what weight feels like it's doing. Now, this is a pretty explicit movement, even though it's small and gentle, of my head and neck. And along with this rotation of my arms, I can let them lift a little bit, spreading the palms, and then relaxing back. So here I'm raising my eyes, really just level, imagining I can see out to the horizon. I'm not looking really up anymore. I am dropping my eyes maybe 45 degrees or slightly less, not too far down. And trying to maintain that same tilt of the pelvis and that same feeling of sitting back a little bit, so that when I lift my arms, I don't lean backward, which is quite easy to do. So I may, in fact, have to compensate slightly by emphasizing that sitting back feeling just a hair, relaxing the pelvis and the posterior tilt as the arms come up. And I've added a lot more ranges of motion here, thanks to the arms. So we have abduction, moving the arms away from the body, as well as external rotation. My palms turn forward, my shoulders externally rotating, forearm supination, palms turn out or upward. And spreading, of course, is activating all the joints in the hand and the wrist. So we're going to look at just a few more of these channel cavities. Channel cavities are, in Chinese medicine, where the deeper channel, the channel that's actually running deep to the muscles, which also contains lots of connective tissue and fascia. Right? This fascia is wrapping the muscles and all the individual sections of each muscle, right? Sort of saran wrap. And that includes the space between the muscles, different muscles and between muscle and bone. It also wraps the bones, periosteum. And so channel cavities are where the deeper flow qi and blood, because really while we talk about qi a lot in therapeutic movement, qi and blood always move together. So qi and blood are more accessible at the deeper level at particular points or cavities. That's why traditionally they call holes or cavities or caves rather than points. The idea is that they penetrate, right, the lines of deep communication, not points on the surface. So one thing I'm doing is spreading my palms a little bit, which activates what's considered really the strongest point or channel cavity in the whole body. It's on the large intestine channel, and here we need not to be fooled by the name too much. The other name is the yang ming or yang brightness channel, which is more useful in this case because, as you might guess, this channel being in the arm, it doesn't necessarily have a lot to do directly with the large intestine in the abdomen. So in this case, its name has more to do with sort of symbolic and systematic style of naming things in Chinese medicine, rather than a lot of concrete clear concrete relationship between this thing named the large intestine channel and what's going on down in my gut. What it does do is it really strongly activates qi and blood throughout the whole body. It's a mover. And this is considered the most moving cavity in the body. So if things are stuck, if the circulation is not moving freely, if there are things I need to expel from the body, again, in Chinese medicine, these climatological abating forces carried by wind, this is one of the most important points. And just a gentle spreading or abduction of the hands, and then relaxing back, creates a kind of pumping effect that stimulates that area. And again, I might start to feel some sort of fullness, right, if I do it, right? If the area, if things are really stuck along that channel, I might even feel a little sore. With this rotation, I'm also activating points around the wrist and the elbow, where more cavities tend to be clustered around the joints. So thinking about the large intestine channel, there are two more points, just one right below and one right at that outer elbow here. And I can feel that area. If I just rotate my arm, the lower arm, I can feel how it activates the muscles in that area. It's pulling on the fascia. Connective tissue is a very good place to look for understanding the channels, channel cavities, and their sort of larger influence. So while muscles tend to be very discrete, very specific areas, the connective tissue has this larger sort of integrity, structural influence, pull on one sort of elastic tissue, and it influences, it pulls on other sheets of elastic tissue, and so on through the body. It's a good way to start looking for and understanding the channel system. So the large intestine channel is a yang channel, so it's implicitly in communication with what we were just talking about in the back, and the governing vessel. Runs up through the shoulder, up through the neck, and jaw into the face. So of course I'm also rotating the shoulder a little bit. And while not all exercises need to be or even should be coordinated with the breath, this one will tend to happen that way. Most of our, after a few repetitions at least, tend to find themselves inhaling and exhaling. But I don't need to mentally create that timing. I'm not trying to enforce a breathing ritual. I want to feel how lifting the eyes and feeling that little bit of a lift in the chest as the arms come up really creates an inhalation. I don't have to then think, oh, now's the time to inhale. That's doing extra work. It's a double job. But the overall posture, the head carriage, the pelvic tilt, leads the weight down and also leads the breath down. So as I inhale, it does not feel like a big forced chest breath, but the movement in the chest feels fairly light and subtle, whereas the quality of the breath in the lower abdomen feels more full and more concentrated. Another yin-yang relationship. Yang should be fine and light, and yin should be more stable, right? Consolidated, full feeling. That's a healthy relationship of them, according to Chinese medicine. So I never want to keep breath out of the chest. That would be ridiculous. That's where lungs are. But the quality of movement I feel there is going to be much subtler, much finer. It's going to be a lift of the rib cage as part of a natural breath. It's not going to be exaggerated or forced. But I do want to feel a sense of consolidating down here. So jumping back for a moment to the idea of the kidneys as the root of the body, the deepest level, and that the lung qi, which is different from air, right? Air is just moving in and out of the lungs, but the qi of the lung, the influence of the lung, or the movement of the lung can be felt down here. In this case, we have to regard the diaphragm in some way as also part of that lung system. Well, it's its own muscle. You think of the diaphragm's influence on the lungs, moving air in and out. But in Chinese medicine, we also think of the lungs' influence and dominance over the diaphragm. The lungs control descending movement, especially when in reference to breath. That feeling of fullness down, the further I feel it down in the abdomen, the more free and activated the lung qi is. So that's put in terms of the relationship with the deepest part of the body, or the kidneys. Interestingly enough, the kidneys, when you include the adrenals, have a whole bunch of influence over the communication in our bloodstream with a whole host of organs, including the lungs. And so the adrenals actually have an influence over lung function in terms of the rate of respiration. Not necessarily the Chinese were fully aware of that 2,000 years ago, but they were on to something at least intuitively in terms of the feeling of the body. So let's do one more variation of this where I bring the hands to the front, palms of them down. Now here the movement of my head becomes even more subtle, but it's still there. So initially looking up and down, I was looking about 45 degrees down, 45 degrees up. Became a little smaller when I was lifting the arms, it was coming up level. Back. And now here I'm going to bring my gaze slightly down, but more in. My focus in a little closer to my body, and then looking out to the distance. The movement of the arms is really still quite similar. Palms are spreading, palms are turning up, supinating, shoulders rotating gently. Here I want to avoid pinching my shoulder blades together. So I feel a kind of gentle consolidation in the back plane of the body as the chest opens, but not pinching the shoulder blades or letting them wing back. Relatively subtle feeling. What's happening with the breath in the lower body, still very much the same. And I may start to develop that feeling of a line of continuous gentle stretch or pull from the index finger and the thumb, which is the lung channel. They run parallel to one another. One is yang, one is yin. So I consider it a yin-yang pair. Through the top and front of the shoulder and even up through the neck or the jaw. Through the jaw and into the face. We're very sensitive to it. So my eyes come in a little bit, so it's a very subtle movement of my head, right? Not particularly visible from the outside, but I'm focusing in a little closer, very soft, not staring, and then looking to the distance, which creates that subtle lift again. So we've made some of the movements more subtle. We've again retained everything we were doing previous. So as I feel that consolidation, that gentle squeezing of the back, I can maybe even feel it up into the neck. And as the hands come forward, that area spreads and releases. We're looking for these gentle feeling of pumping, right? Of stretching the tissue and then allowing it back into elastic recoil. As a way of thinking about driving the circulation, blood, chi, and body fluids through the superficial tissues, but also the communication of these long chains. And here, not just one, the large intestine, or two, the large intestine and lung, connecting that to what's happening along the axial skeleton, the dew channel. Loving the arms now. Now, if we take this idea, maybe not one, but a few steps further, we can start to see some of the exercises that show up in the second series, the CPM2 series, like the animal play. And we have a movement that's often associated with the lung and the fall, which is the tiger. And the tiger starts by sort of trying its claws. There's a feeling now of lifting up through the body. So rather than simply releasing down into the ground, I'm emphasizing a lift up, pulling up from the ground, up in front of the body, and then pushing up overhead. And then a pulling down from above. And pressing down. And I'm really going to breathe at a comfortable rate here and not worry about when I'm supposed to be inhaling or exhaling. But if I can still feel the breath active, breath defined as a musculoskeletal movement, driven primarily by the diaphragm, feel that down in my belly, that's good. If I can't, I'm going to think about just those basic postural issues. Pelvic tilt, the head carriage. Here's some much bigger head movement again. Up and pressing low. Pulling down. And then pressing down. Primarily by thinking of releasing my weight down from my neck and shoulders through my arms, rather than tensing my muscles. And you'll see I'm starting the movement a little bit with a slight knee bend. Bending the knees, pull, and then starting to straighten up. And this is initiating another of these pumping movements. Slightly pressing the feet flat as I bend my knees, and my hips are always going to flex a little bit with my knees, ankles as well. And then very subtly straightening up without ever fully straightening the legs. As I press overhead, I want to soften and sink my shoulders, which is something I've been doing just from the very first exercise. And as I press overhead and I sink and relax the shoulders, I can use that visual imagery of just releasing the surface of the body, or it doesn't have to be visual, whatever really works for you. just the sensation even, right? As if you're exhaling not just through the nose, but through all the pores, skin, and especially, again, if I feel like I've been exposed to something that I'd like to get rid of, even if it's just the kind of exposure that's going to give me a stiff neck in the morning, then I think of releasing from the exterior of the body. There's a phase with each one where I feel like I'm gathering from the outside in, which is nourishing, right? Taking in fresh air and oxygen. And here, sending it down to be consolidated in the abdomen, communicating with the kidneys. And then here it feels like I'm drawing up more from the ground. Expressing and releasing. These are a lot of images, but we just have a short class today, so for a taste of a number of things that could be happening in this exercise, but I don't have to be doing all these mental gymnastics. I can just focus on one or two ideas, which in the beginning is often more useful. And there are even other things I could be attending to rather than these particular types of images. So another way of thinking of this exercise is one of communication with sky above us and earth below us. Absorbing, drawing in, or communicating in some way with one type of chi, the yang chi, and then the earthly or yin chi. A simpler version of this kind of movement that is very common in Qigong is where I would just turn the palms up and turn the palms down as they sink. So now we're backing off a little bit from explicitly tigerish feeling with curved fingers, claws. Overall, it has a slightly gentler sensibility. Often in the beginning, the gentler exercises can feel actually much stronger in terms of our awareness of the chi sensation, which includes what? Includes that sense of subtle fullness, of activation, of warmth. This again can have that sense of drawing up through the body, finding that support. Support begins with releasing our weight down in an efficient, economical way, with posture, bones stacked well. But that should start to give us that sense of lift and support really for free, without doing extra work. And when I'm releasing down again, never entirely lose that support. So while there's a yang phase and yin phase of the movement here, lifting up feels more yang, more supportive, more active. Dropping the palms feels softer, more relaxed, releasing downward. These are all yin qualities. There's still a yin quality, releasing weight, releasing tension in the yang phase, and there's still a yang quality of support, lift in the yin phase. And just to talk about one more of these channel cavities and the larger sort of area associated with it. I didn't mention any of the channel cavities from the body, but the best known one is about 1.5 inches below the navel. Qi Hai, or the Sea of Qi, sometimes called Dantian. But then just another inch or so further down, there's another channel cavity, and we really treat them together in as one broader area, along with the region deeper in the abdomen to these external measures. Both of them historically have been at different times in different schools called Dantian, referring to the elixir field or the field of immortality, and associated with sort of complex alchemical processes that people were inventing back in the 2nd and 3rd century. And a lot of the language has been borrowed even for practices that are not explicitly alchemical or about immortality. The idea of a lower elixir field, a lower Dantian, has become much universal in Chinese medicine and health practices and martial arts. Feeling that the breath eventually is centered and concentrated in that area deep to these two cavities. And while much attention is often given to the one that's a little closer to the navel, the one that's just an inch further down, say in many ways, certainly in the rest of Chinese medicine, is even more significant because it supplements not just the yang qi of the body, but also the yin qualities as well. It's more all-purpose, it's more fundamental and more balanced. So think of it as a larger area, not fixated just on that upper point. It is very useful. In fact, we often do not need to distinguish between them at all, but treat them as a larger area, which is fairly common. So if I sit down a little bit and sit back into my hips as if just onto a stool, that can make it a little easier. Feel that lower back releasing, the tailbone dropping under the body. I just want to make sure that as I sit back, my weight stays even, toe to heel. And I can use that backward movement, sort of leave my hands behind. And as I sit back, the hands come up to the lower abdomen. Typical measure would be the base of my thumbs overlapping and overlapping with the navel, which puts my palms a bit lower over that and region. Same overall posture, just perhaps a little deeper than we've been doing. Doing how the lift of the tailbone activates the pelvic floor, just the tip of the tailbone, and helps activate the thighs and support of the inner legs, which can help me relax and release some of that tension in the outer thighs, the quadriceps, etc. So give me more of that stable connection to the ground. Allowing as the weight sinks, the breath to follow. Feel full and concentrated in the lower abdomen. Here, my eyes are focused slightly down. The tilt of my head is very, very subtle. I'm not going to exaggerate that. But lowering my eyes here, I can let my eyelids sink slightly. My eyes don't need to be closed, but at least a little heavy lidded. To help direct my intention more inward. Feeling, imagining, listening inward or seeing inward in Chinese. Inner landscape of the body. This area is directly associated with the kidneys, fundamental root of the body's qi. And thus also that area in the back. So if I can feel a little bit of that movement of the breath, or fullness or warmth or consolidation in that area as well, all the better. If I don't, that's fine, but I should at least know to listen for it. Eventually I will get that feeling. It's helpful not just to be putting all our concentration to the front. Thinking of the abdomen in 3 dimensions, from the back, side to side. Facing up, rising up slightly without entirely losing that bend in the knee. Sink down. On. Pretty well. And now, as the hands come to the side, I'm going to gather them back in towards the center, palm to palm. Inhale. And then turn them out, exhale. And all the exercises I've chosen today have very close affinity. There are lots of ways of looking at the same basic dynamics. So here, as the hands turn in, I am going to consciously inhale, but in a very relaxed, slow, even, deep manner. As I inhale, I feel that gentle fullness in the abdomen, and perhaps between the palms as well. As I was holding the ball and gently squeezing it in, and just gently compressing the air between my hands. And the space in front of the body, in the sense, belonging to that interior space, the yin space. And then as I exhale, the palms turning out. And in this case, I'm going to draw my thumb in towards my index finger, sort of closing off that area we were talking about before. Large intestine, or the joined valley, is what this channel cavity is called, because it's like the valley between the two bones, thumb and the index finger, that carpets. Here everything spreads out, the palms rounder, like holding the ball and gathering it in with a gentle squeeze, and now if you notice the palms turning in, right, that's the same as palms being up. Before, my arms were separate when I was inhaling. The palms were up. So some part of it is actually still the same kind of coordination. Other parts are different. And I can feel how the inside of the shoulder, we call the shoulder's nest, is opening up a little bit, making space here for the breath, and also the activation of the lung channel, which I mentioned is running parallel to the large intestine channel, and moves through that front shoulder crease, hollow there, down into the upper ribs where it enters the body. Whereas when I exhale and turn the hands out, the shoulders rotating in, leading us to a slightly closed feeling in this area. So closing here, closing up here. The idea is that kind of sealing off the exterior gently as we exhale, so that we're taking in fresh chi along with our breath, along with the air. And then as we exhale, we're letting it consolidate in the body rather than letting it all escape again. Right? So the part of the air we don't need, like the CO2 that's moving out of the bloodstream back into the lungs and can be exhaled, that can leave. Right? But the vital part of the chi, which is not cognate, particularly with oxygen, in the program we talked about how oxygen's not a great translation for chi either, just like energy. The sense, the image that something vital is left behind, consolidated in the body during the exhale. And so this is a variation of this simple exercise. It's considered very supplementing. The body is deficient, our energy is flagging. And this is the variation that's recommended. So it emphasizes more of that gathering in and less that expelling. So we see another yin-yang pair, supplementing, gathering into the body. Is more yin, it's nourishing and supplementing, it's moving inward. Expelling pathogenic forces to the exterior is considered more yang. Let's look at a few self-massages based on primarily the areas we've looked at. So first of all, with fingertips, I'm just going to dredge the scalp. The scalp is a very yang surface, right? Standing, it's always facing the sky. It's full of yang channels and no yin ones. Covering the ears, tapping at the base of the head. This part of that area affected so much by wind. So cover the ear, tap at the base of the head. Pretty common exercise again in Qigong, but with the intention of releasing either to the exterior or releasing down through the body. It can be very calming as well. There's actually a concept of interior wind, which is a different etiology, but has a similar sort of set of metaphors around it. The interior wind needs to be sort of relaxed or sometimes subdued. And then reaching across the body to the back of the neck and gently pulling the neck area. So I turn my head, reach back, keeping the shoulder relaxed, and look to the front, and the weight of the arm just drag that hand forward in clearing those channels. Anything I'm doing, the scalp, the base of the head, the neck, it's all going to tend to be on the idea of clearing and descending and relaxing. It's not an area where we tend to think of doing much supplementation, except in very specific contexts that have to do with that governing vessel, but not the yang channels. So it may sound like a lot of information, but we unpack it in the programs a lot more slowly than I'm doing today. I'm just tossing a bunch of stuff out there as mixture. Then with a cupped hand patting, root 14, base of the neck, up the back. And we can move the opposite shoulder. It's a nice firm pat, again with the intention of releasing. Percussion is often used to help move things that are really stuck. When chi is stuck, unless there's a real obstruction there, in which case it's not chi per se that's stuck, it's usually much easier to get it moving than say when the blood is old and sticky and stuck in the tissues. Blood stasis, percussion is a technique that's often used for releasing spasm in the muscles and blood stasis in the tissues, so that it's light, it's not too heavy-handed, but it does have a sort of a vigorous percussive aspect that shakes everything up to free the tissue layers that are trapping the circulation. If I look to the front of the shoulder, this area inside the shoulder associated particularly with the lung channel, which is the yin channel, and perhaps tends towards deficiency. Here I'm just going to rub that area in a circle for a lightly, both relaxing but also warming effect. Warming effects are typically supplemented with the intention of warming and supplementing the lungs. Lungs as a yin organ are very susceptible to cold, right? And in particular this season to dryness. This doesn't necessarily address the dryness directly, except in terms of strengthening the whole system. Then I push down the inside of the arm. The whole inside of the arm is a yin surface, and I don't need to think about separate channels, just that big yin surface. The back of the arm is a yang surface. Another idea that we'll introduce is that the channels moving down the inside of the arm are descending from the trunk towards the extremity, and the ones coming up the back of the arm are ascending from the extremity to the torso and neck. So this would be going with that direction. Instead of regulating or strengthening the function of the channels. We go in the opposite direction, from the shoulder down towards the fingers on the outside and up the inside, is also used. It's considered counterflow to the normal direction of the channels and thus dispersing. And dispersing, as I mentioned before, is more
Tim, I think your sound just went out and there's something fuzzy happening with the picture.
that's because my phone was not on airplane, and something was coming in and it was vibrating to let me know. Didn't need to know this moment. So the picture should have stabilized now because it's stopped vibrating. So that's with the flow down the inside, up the outside, and then the counter flow used in particular when there's something to disperse, some excess, some obstruction to flow. How do we know there's excess or obstruction to flow? And the most common way to know is pain. Chinese medicine, when there's pain, means there's no flow. I'll give each finger a little shake. The channel cavities, the further you go to the extremity, the stronger they tend to be. So the strongest cavities are from the elbow and knees down, and then even more so from the wrist, and then the ones at the fingertips and toe tips are particularly strong for activating the whole channel. Let's do just a little bit more. It's going to percuss the lower back a little bit. Again, this is the area associated with the kidneys that we'll discuss at least very briefly today. Tension in this area can be associated with the kidney system, but it can be associated with other systems as well. So there's no simple one-to-one correlation between a stiff or painful lower back and one organ system. Sometimes the problem is primarily associated with what they call the sinew level, meaning it's happening at the level of the musculature. It doesn't have to inherently involve an organ system. And the channel sinews, meaning the muscles and connective tissue associated with the primary channels, are considered more superficial to those channels. So they're in communication with the deep channels, they're not synonymous with it. Right? So problems going to exist at the superficial level that are not these deep organizational problems that Chinese medicine often seems to fall on. And then we just rub up and down. Circle a little bit, keeping the shoulders relaxed. Warming this area a little bit with this light friction is generally beneficial and relaxing. And if I can keep my basic posture a little bit as I do it, so knees and hips are soft, a little posterior tilt, and it's a little easier for that movement and warmth to penetrate. Then I'm going to push down the outside of the leg, extending my knees. And pull up the inside. The outer legs would be the yang channels, the inner legs, the yin channels, and the circulation in the legs is considered to be the opposite of that in the arms. So here we go down the yang channels, up the yin channels, and that's with the flow, the normal flow of qi in the channel. But again, we can go counterflow as well, down the inside, back. As I bend forward, I'm doing a little bit of back bend, but mostly it's in my hips. So I'm rounding my back just slightly and not sagging at the waist. I'm not hanging my head down. Doing most of the work in my hips, bending my knees slightly, and then feel how the elastic recoil again sort of helps lift me. So if I'm very gently bending with the whole body, sort of like loading a spring, and then I just release up again, and I don't have to do a lot of work. Going down or up. Going up over the hip bones. There's some like key channel cavities in this area. And then on my fingertips at least are going around the ankle bones. The ankles are surrounded by channel cavities for all the leg channels. Shake the legs. Might just do a little bit of patting on the abdomen to finish up. Especially if any postural work or thinking about the breath has encouraged me to stiffen up in the abdomen at all. Just things moving. And relax fist. Patting the chest. Abdomen. Back. Hips. Thighs. Shake out. Thank you. Short introduction. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Tim. Have a great rest of the day.
You too.